Tony, you're going to be our final speaker. You have 10 minutes, and then we'll take a break to look at Q&A before we come back to
Yeah, I think I'll
whether...
need slightly more than 10 minutes, but anyway, uh, people can read about the Kastner trial in all sorts of places. There's my own book. There is Ben Hecht's Perfidy, which was the first book. Hecht was a Zionist, a right-wing Zionist, but he pretty faithfully followed the transcripts of the trial. And if you ignore all the Zionist bits, then you'll see what outraged the Zionists by his book. They actually tried to buy up every copy so people couldn't read it. There's a number of different accounts. There's a very good one by Akiva Raw in a book called Perdition. And there's also a book by an appalling Zionist called Paul Bogner, called Kastner's Crimes. Ignore again the nonsense about the fact that Kastner was an individual rather than the representative as he was of the Jewish Agency and the World Jewish Congress, because when he went to Nuremberg, his expenses were paid by the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish Agency. And he freed not only Kurt Becher, but two of Eichmann's closest butchers, Dieter Riseni and Hermann Krumi, who was Eichmann's second in command in Hungary, who was in charge of the nuts and bolts of the extermination, the deportations, arranging the times of the trains, and so on. But I wanted to really comment more widely, in a sense, because we see the way that the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is being weaponized constantly throughout Israel's genocide, as we witness the massacre of Palestinians, the complete destruction of civil society, the attack on the hospitals, for instance. I remember reading the book, the Grey Book, I think it was called, describing how the fascists in Budapest attacked two Jewish hospitals. And it was described at the very end of the occupation, because between October and January, the fascist Neolas, the Iron Cross, took power, and fascist hordes basically assassinated someone. Basically assassinated the doctors and the patients in two hospitals and killed them. And that was described as one of the blackest deeds of the war. And yet we've seen Israel repeatedly attack hospitals. They've just bombed the third floor of the Kamal Adwan hospital. They bombed tent encampments outside the Al-Aqsa hospital, literally burning alive people in those tents. So, I mean, the horrors of northern Gaza are equivalent in many ways to the Holocaust. And yet Western leaders say absolutely nothing about it. But they were massively concerned, of course, about the violence in Amsterdam. It was even compared to Kristallnacht. I mean, it's quite amazing because I wasn't aware at Kristallnacht the Jews of Germany had gone round chanting death to the Aryans or death to the Germans, or may your houses and villages burn, or attacking individual Germans. I mean, the idea that you can compare the Nazi pogrom to what happened in Amsterdam is really absolutely obscene. But it's a sign of the cynicism of the ruling class in the West. People like von der Leyen, Keir Starmer, of course, our own puppet foreign minister, David Lammy, Biden, and the rest of them. But I have no doubt that if we could project ourselves back 90 years and von der Leyen was about, she would be a member of the German Conservative Party that put Hitler in power, because it was the German Deutsche National Volksparty, which formed an alliance with Hitler, if you remember. Von Papen, its leader, was a deputy Führer. he believed he could tame Hitler, but Hitler had other ideas. Likewise, the British, they may go on about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust now, but the Labour Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, set his face against admitting any Jewish refugees at all, with the result that 2,000 who were trapped in Vichy, France, in the Vittel camp were deported to Auschwitz because he refused to admit them. So the pious hypocrisy of Western leaders now contrasts with the record of the bourgeois leaders at the time. And I have no doubt if they were there then, they would repeat exactly what is done. So the lessons they draw are very specific ones, and they have nothing to do with the record of their states. And I've just had published in Al Jazeera an article on why the German state is so avid in its support of Israel. And in essence, the German state has been involved in a whole number of Holocausts, the East African Holocaust, the Holocaust in Southwest Africa, the Armenian genocide it was integrally involved in, and of course the Nazi Holocaust itself. So it's not any surprise that it smiles upon the Israeli Holocaust. Indeed, it must give it a great deal of pleasure that the victims of the Nazi Holocaust are now perpetrating their own Holocaust. It kind of justifies everything that they've done. So this is the kind of hypocrisy we are dealing with. But this webinar came about because Jonathan Freedland wrote a biography of Rudolf Vrba, who, with Alfred Wetzler, was the second and third Jewish prisoners to escape from Auschwitz on the 10th of April. And they reached Slovakia on the 24th of April, 1944, where they met massive obstruction. And Vrba made clear his hostility to the Zionist Kastner in particular, but not just Kastner, because they wrote down something called the Auschwitz Protocols, or the Rudolf or the Vrba-Wetzler report, which gave for the first time a detail of the outline of Auschwitz, that it was an extermination, not a labor camp. And he expected that when this report was handed to Kastner, which it was at the end of April 1944, that it would be distributed and circulated widely within Hungary. But of course, that did not happen because, as Chaim has mentioned, Kastner was involved in negotiations with Eichmann about a safe train out of Hungary for the Zionists and the Jewish elite, the rich, and so on. And so the last thing he wanted to do was to upset those negotiations by distributing a report to the ordinary Hungarian masses. I mean, Zionist historian Yehuda Bohr, who's just died, who was the chief Holocaust historian of theirs, justified this by saying, well, they wouldn't have taken any notice of it anyway, that knowing is not knowing, that knowing is not knowledge. But this is nonsense. A number of people have said, including Eli Wiesel, who was ardent a Zionist as you could possibly have, have said that if they had known where the deportation trains were going, they would not have got on. They would have taken advantage of the offer of ordinary Hungarians to hide them in the mountains and so on. There is absolutely no doubt that far more of Hungary's Jews would have survived. As it was, 437,000 of them were deported to Auschwitz, where the vast majority of them were exterminated. But Friedland, I wondered why, as the Guardian Zionist gatekeeper, should choose of all people to write a biography of Rudolf Vrba. And the reason became clear when I started to read the book. And it was clear that what he was doing was a quite subtle justification of what the Zionists had been doing to Vrba, because Vrba's book, I Escaped from Auschwitz, or I Cannot Forgive, which was published in virtually every language worldwide, was not published in Israel till the end of the 1990s, when an Israeli education professor, Ruth Lynn, happened to meet him at British Columbia University and was entranced by his story and ensured that he was both given an honorary doctorate at Haifa University, but also his book was published. But Yad Vashem, the so-called Holocaust Museum, which is really just a propaganda outlet in Jerusalem for visiting diplomats, racists, neo-Nazis, and the like, refused to print his book, as they had refused to print Marek Edelman, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance's book, as they had refused to print Raoul Hilberg, the most distinguished Holocaust historian has ever been, his Destruction of the Jews, because the messages they conveyed were not the ones the Zionists wished to hear. So the Zionists and the Israeli state have been embarked on a very serious rewriting of the Holocaust to fit in with their own message. And that message, in essence, is it's not never again for everyone, but never again for the Jews only, in the words of Yehuda Elkanah. But I just wanted to comment on some of the things that Jonathan Freedland, who I've described elsewhere as probably Britain's most dishonest journalist, and he has a lot of competition, so it is quite an accolade. In his book, Freedland notes that the escapees' two names had been anonymized because wherever they were written about in Israeli history, they were described as two Jewish escapees, two Jewish chaps, and other forms, but never by name. Yet he found this acceptable, quote, because he was not an easy sell in Israel or in the mainstream Jewish diaspora. Well, that begs the question, what exactly was being sold? In the mainstream Jewish diaspora, his books were widely available. In fact, they were serialized in the Daily Herald in 1961, so he was well known in the diaspora. But in Israel, no mention whatsoever in school history texts was made of Vrba or Wetzler. In Friedland's view, the problem was that Vrba had made a hinted suggestion that Zionism was prepared to sacrifice the massive European Jewry in order to establish the Israeli state. Well, that's exactly what Ben-Gurion said, and that's in his official biography by Shabtai Teva. It is a job of Zionism not to save the remnant of Israel in Europe, but rather to save the land of Israel for the people and the Yeshuv. And as Marek Edelman of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance said, during the war, it never even entered any of our minds that the Zionists were deliberately remaining passive in regard to the physical destruction of the Jews in order to additionally justify the founding the state of Israel. And that was one of the reasons why when Marek Edelman died in 2008 in Poland, he was given a state funeral. The president gave the oration. There was a 15-gun salute, but not one single representative of the Israeli state was there, or any of the associated Holocaust organizations that they run. And Freedland justified Vrba's silencing because handing a platform to Vrba may have come to seem like a risk. The question is, a risk to whom or to what? The truth or the Zionist rewriting of Holocaust history? And Freedland suggests that he should have softened his message to make it more palatable. I mean, I could go on, but I've got other things I very quickly want to say. I mean, the Holocaust has been used to exceptionalize Jews as unique victims of racism, which is absolutely nonsense, of course. The Holocaust, including the Nazi Holocaust, had many victims. The Roma, Sinti were equally victims and died proportionally in the same numbers as the Jews. Arguably, the Holocaust began with the so-called euthanasia campaign directed at Germany's disabled. And of course, with the 3 million plus Russian prisoners of war, plus 20 million Russian civilians. Vital components of Holocaust historiography were the idea of uniqueness. What made, in Yehuda Bohr's words, the Holocaust unique was the motivation of the murderers, and that the Nazis were a political elite that had come to power with pseudo-messianic concepts of saving humanity from the Jews. But that really is absolute nonsense. If you look at the period 1930 to 1933, as other Holocaust historians have, and which even Yehuda Bohr accepts, the Nazis made virtually no mention of the Jews. Their platform was mainly anti-communist. It had nothing to do with the Jews at all. Hitler's obsession with the Jews was because he saw them as the biological parents of Bolshevism. For Zionism, the Holocaust was inexplicable, because if you could explain the Holocaust, then it would have been possible, and it would be possible, to oppose anti-Semitism. But for the Zionists, anti-Semitism is inherent in the non-Jewish DNA, as it were. And the Zionists were quite clear about their use and abuse of the Holocaust. Drawing universal lessons from the Holocaust meant the plunder of Jewish moral capital, and that's in Peter Novick's The Holocaust in American Life. Gerhard Riegner, who was a representative of one wing of the Zionists, I think it was the World Jewish Congress, declared that Auschwitz was not only a national memory belonging to the Jewish people, it was also an important political asset, and that can be found in Tom Segev's The Seventh Million. Edith Zertel, a political scientist in Israel, in a book, The Politics of Nationhood, described how the transference of the Holocaust situation onto the Middle East reality not only created a false sense of the imminent danger of mass destruction, it also immensely distorted the image of the Holocaust, dwarfed the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, trivializing the unique agony of the victims and the survivors, and utterly demonizing the Arabs and their leaders. Because for Zionism, it wasn't the Nazis, it was the Arabs who were the main enemy. And in fact, the Arabs have been consistently called the new Nazis. And in his attempt by the Zionists, by Yehuda Bohr in particular, to say that the Holocaust only applies to Jews, I mean, he described the Nazi targeting of gypsies as because of their tendency to criminality and wandering around. And in a debate with Sybil Milton, who was the chief resident historian of the US Holocaust Museum, herself Jewish, she just responded in a debate, defining an entire ethnic group as antisocial and criminal is a classic example of racism. I do not know why Mr. Bohr does not understand this. Well, the reason is, of course, because Zionism draws such different lessons, if you like, from the Holocaust. And I'd like to just finish with Yehuda Alkner, who was a child survivor of Auschwitz and a former rector and president of the Central University in Budapest before Viktor Orban forced it out. And he wrote in a famous article, The Need to Forget, that is the Holocaust, in 1985, he wrote, a profound existential angst fed by a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust, that we are the eternal victim. In this ancient belief, I see the tragic and paradoxical victory of Hitler. Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. A minority who assert this must never happen again, and a frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen again to us. So I will leave it there, just to say thank you very much. And I hope that this webinar has gone some way, at least, to explaining how Zionism, in its genocidal capacity today, and that should be very clear with what it's doing in northern Gaza now, is utilizing the Holocaust to justify its own Holocaust. And I can't really think of anything more obscene. I also noticed that Stephen Kapos has joined us. I would hope that he would also be able to speak for at least 10 minutes. even if that does reduce the time for question and answers. But once again, many thanks.